So good evening, everyone. Part of what we're going to be doing today is, well, actually, most of you have probably seen what we have been doing, and I'm just going to quickly, but I wanted to focus on a couple of things within this. Oops, let me just pull it up here. There we go. Okay. Oh, okay. So I went through at the last session just a very brief introduction, and I wanted to continue on with that, particularly. So last session I talked about how we the teachings of the Buddha was transmitted following his passing. How after there were several what we call Sangha councils in which the greatest monks got together and they discussed the teachings. And at the first council, they set up the 10 great disciples, of which Ananda, the cousin of the Buddha, he recited the teachings, and Upali explained the rules, the Vinaya rules. And so for first 100 years or so, it remained very, very strict and pure as to what the teachings were. And then we get into about, after about 200 years after the Buddha passed away, we get into the area of, oh, wait a minute, sorry. Why is this jumping? Right, so after 100 years, then we get into the second Dharma Council in Vaishali, and then we get into the division of two main groups, the Way of the Elders and the Great Assembly. And the Way of the Elders claim that the other group was too lax, and there's a sort of a schism that happens. But more importantly than what's going on within the Buddhist circle of the Sangha is what was going outside of it. And this is when we come to the rule of King Ashoka. You probably have heard of King Ashoka. He was actually a great follower of the Buddha. In fact, he may have been the single most important person in promoting Buddhism. However, he's not as nice as we think he could be, because he was actually quite the dictator, and he conquered the area that you see in blue here, what we call the Maurya Empire, and he conquered ruthlessly. And it was said that he was such a ruthless individual that in order to get the reins of the throne, he tricked his older brother into entering a pit of burning coal and had him burned alive. So not a very nice person. And it was said that one time that Ashoka invaded the neighboring Kalinga kingdom and said he slaughtered 10,000 people, 100,000 people. And it was only after that that he went to the site where a lot of the people were killed, and he realized the pain and hurt that he had caused so many people. And from that moment on, he sort of turned a new leaf and became a follower of the Buddha. And in fact, to promote the peace and harmony, so when the historical Buddha passed away, he passed away at a place called Kushinagra. And what happened was after he passed away at Kushinagra, they cremated the remains of the Buddha, and they divided those remains into 8 parts, and they created stupas. They were basically mounds, the cemeteries or grave sites where these relics of the Buddha were held. So they were at various important places that were places that were important to the Buddha while he was alive. And so Ashoka, what he did was he actually got those 8 stupas unearthed, and it's said that he promoted building temples and other structures, and created 80. Well, legend says he created 84,000 stupas, but there's no way he created that many stupas. But he did promote the spreading of the Dharma by sending missionaries to surrounding kingdoms, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Afghanistan, China, Thailand, and even to Greece. So through his endeavors, Ashoka really spread the teaching or the Dharma throughout Asia. And if nothing else, because of his support of the Dharma, many new developments arise just after the period of Ashoka. So the missionaries that went to Sri Lanka then created what we call the formation of the Theravada branch of Buddhism. And it was here that the first texts were written in form of palm leaves. And this became the basis of what we call the Pali Suttas, which is, they claim to be the more orthodox or the canon of Theravada Buddhism. And Ashoka also created the third Sangha Council around 240 BC. And it is at this third gathering that the 3 baskets get formalized. The Sutta Pitaka, words of the Buddha, the Vinaya, rules of precepts Pitaka, and the Abhidharma Pitaka is the in-depth studies of those teachings of the Buddha by the great monks and followers of the Buddha. So with the spreading of Buddhism, and as he spread the missionaries throughout, one of the places was in northwestern part of India. There's a place called Gandhara, and you can see the early forms of Buddhist art in this area, Gandhara. And you can also see how this, at that time, there was a lot of intermingling with some European influence. So you can see they almost look like Greek figurines, these statues. And of course, along with that, from Gandhara, some of these monks went on the caravans to the Silk Road through Afghanistan, northern China. And we see in Afghanistan where the Bamyan Buddhas were the ones that were destroyed. But they look sort of like, this is one of them that was there. So after Ashoka passed away, though, their empire, which has spread throughout most of Southeast Asia, had and they spread Buddhism and Hinduism to places as far as Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, of course, Indonesia and Singapore. And also through Pakistan and Afghanistan. So all these areas were now places where Buddhism had spread. And of course, in later centuries, they developed and stayed in those areas. So through the 7th to the 12th century, Malaysia and Indonesia was one country. And of course, we have the Borobudur Buddhist temple. And then in the 12th century, Angkor Wat's Buddhist temple was erected in Cambodia area, and then so forth, and then spreading on to Thailand. And throughout those centuries, there were different schools. So the Theravada Buddhism, way of elders, Pali was the main language used in the transmission, and it's seen in the countries of Sri Lanka, Thai, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And several other countries have both Theravada and Mahayana schools of Buddhism. And the main feature of the Theravada is the prominence of the Sangha and the strict adherence to the precepts that were originally told at the time of the first Sangha Council. Interestingly enough, even to this day, we sometimes do things together with the different schools of Buddhism. We are very fortunate here in North America and in Vancouver as well, in that we actually have a really good representation of all the various schools of Buddhism that exist in the world. And so there are opportunities when the different Buddhist schools get together and do activities together. Here in Vancouver, we have the BC Buddhist Festival. We used to do pre-pandemic at Queen Elizabeth Park, and there might be several thousand people that attend from all the various temples. It's quite an interesting activity. But what was interesting is running up to that BC Buddhist Festival, we would have some meetings of, we would call it the Sangha Council as well. And there's a stark difference amongst most of the Buddhist schools, and in particular our school of Buddhism, in that the Sangha, or the ordained monk, had a very different role. So in these Sangha Council meetings, the Sangha, we would all sit at the table, and the lay people will be sitting behind the monks. They wouldn't sit at the table. And that was the differentiation between the Sangha and the lay individuals. And so when it comes to things like when we would have meals together, the lay people would serve the Sangha. The Sangha would sit there and we would just receive it. Interesting aside, back when I was still in Toronto, I conducted together a wedding of East Indian couple. And what's interesting is that in India, there is actually very few Buddhists left. So Buddhism basically died out in India. Hinduism and the Muslim Islam stayed. Well, predominantly Hinduism is the major religion of India, and there's a small percentage of Muslims that exist in India, but Buddhism itself almost basically died out in India, even though it's spread throughout Asia. Where it was founded in India, it had died down until the early 20th century, when there was a person by the name of Dr. Ambedkar. He was a doctor, and he actually became the Minister of Education for India. But he realized that there was a great disparity amongst the various caste systems, particular what they call the untouchables. And so this Dr. Ambedkar created what we call the Ambedkar Society. and he promoted Buddhism for people of all walks of life. And so from that point on, there's a movement, and there are a number of uh, Indian Buddhists who belonging to this Ambedkar Society who have come here to North America as well. So I had the good fortune to conduct a wedding ceremony together with some Sri Lankan monks. But in the Sri Lankan teaching, in the Theravada Buddhist teachings, weddings are not part of their uh, actual function. Because if you go back to the historical Buddha, he actually left his marriage. So it was said that at the age of 29, the historical Buddha left his wife and Yashodhara and his newborn son, Rahula. The Buddha left him in search of the truth. And so from that point on, in the strict Buddhist Sangha sense, marriage was seen to be a secular attachment. And so conducting wedding ceremonies is not part of their activities as a Sangha. So in South Asia, what's most common is that people would have a wedding ceremony if they were, say, in India, in that area, they would normally have like a Hindu wedding ceremony, and then they would go to the Buddhist temple afterwards, and the couple will be blessed by the monks. So, but with this Indian group, the Ambedkar Society, they actually do want to have Buddhist weddings. So what sometimes happens, they often, because the Sri Lankan monks are the closest to them, they would ask them to conduct the wedding ceremonies, but because it's not part of their practice, none of the Sri Lankan monks have the license. They're not recognized by the provincial government to conduct wedding ceremonies. Now, in our tradition, we do conduct wedding ceremonies, and we've been conducting wedding ceremonies for a long time. In fact, the founder of our tradition, Shinran Shoni, openly got married. So marriage is considered a very important aspect of our teachings. So what would happen is when these Indian people from the Ambedkar Society wanted to do a wedding, they would often contact our temple, and we would do it together with the Sri Lankan monks, where I would conduct the secular, the administrative aspect of it, signing the marriage certificate and things like that. And then the Sri Lankan monks would also chant to bless the couple. So in doing one of these wedding ceremonies, so after the ceremony, there was a reception, and I was invited together with the Sri Lankan monks. And as we sat at our table, the wedding party would bring us our food to eat, which is a tradition that, the lay would feed the Sangha. Now, because I look like I do with my, with hair and dressed in Western attire, they brought me different types of curry. Curry was the main dish, but along with it, they brought like tandoori chicken and, stuff like that, meat basically. But they would not give the Sri Lankan monks any meat because the East Indians were basically, many of them were vegetarian. And it was then that one of the Sri Lankan monks looked at me and he said, with a smile, he said, we can actually eat meat if somebody presents it to us, but nobody ever presents it to us. So I felt kind of guilty eating the chicken, but I mean, it is what it is. But anyways, so the Theravada schools tend to be much more strict in their way of following precepts and orders. And of course, the Northern Buddhist schools, which China, Korea, Japan, and Chinese is the base language used for them, is what we call the Mahayana Sutra teachings. So the Tibetan is actually a unique form of Buddhism, and it's what we call the Tantric or esoteric Buddhism. And you'll find it in northern India, Nepal, Bhutan, Mongolia, and Tibet, of course, and some Japanese, Nikkyo. And yeah, so then, of course, Buddhism spread through China, Korea, and then Japan. Now, as part of the spreading of Buddhism, we have different schools that are formed, and particularly after Ashoka and his great desire to have the Buddhist teaching spread, and as I mentioned, missionaries were spread throughout Asia. Buddhism quickly caught on in various places. And also, as it developed, we begin to see the development of what we call Pure Land Buddhism. And or with the growth of Mahayana Buddhism, we see the development of Pure Land Buddhism. So it's said that the Theravada school is the school that is based on the words spoken by the Buddha. So they're very literal in how they understand things. Whereas what we call the Mahayana tends to focus on the samadhi or the consciousness of the Buddha. So what that means is that the Mahayana school tends to be more talking about the ideals that the Buddha was trying to promote to us, and therefore new sutras actually begin showing up. It's about around 200 BC that it starts popping up. And these are all based on, it said through the samadhi of the Buddha, the consciousness of Buddha. These sutras tend to be a little bit more ephemeral, and they talk about more universal things as opposed to something that's very concrete. Like the Theravada Buddhist is very concrete in its understanding of the teachings. You know, if you are suffering, this is the cause of your suffering, and here's how you get out of that suffering. So, and it's talking basically about the self, very much about the self. However, with the Mahayana Buddhism, it sort of expands the ideology of Buddhism, and it talks about universal truths. And there's a new movement. It began promoting the idea of that there is there's an idea which transcends what we call the mundane. So something that goes beyond the ego self. Okay? And this is where you get into the ideas of things such as sunyata or emptiness. And as we begin to expand our understanding of Buddhism, there's introduced what we call the Sambhogakaya or reward bodies. And these are manifestations of what we call Dharmakaya. So kaya is body. And Dharmakaya has no shape, no form. It is very difficult for us to fathom. But from that, there is something that is expressed, and that's what we call the Sambhogakaya, the reward body. And these often tend to point to things such as infinite wisdom or infinite compassion, universal oneness, all these things that tend to be beyond our conceptualization. Through these Dharma bodies or reward bodies, we're able to get a grasp of some sort of idea. And one of the more popular ideas that are formed at this time becomes this idea of Amida Buddha, the Buddha of infinite light, Amitabha Buddha, and infinite life, Amitayus Buddha. And there are literally over close to 300 sutras in which Amida is presented, sometimes only as a name amongst a list of many other Buddhas, but there are close to 300 sutras with Amida in there. But there are three, Honen Shonin, one of the seven great patriarchs, the teacher of Shinran Shonin, our founder, he pointed out that there are three main sutras that focus strictly on Amida, and he called this the largest Skavati Vyuha Sutra, or Bussetsu Daimuryo Jukyo in Japanese, a larger sutra on Amida, and the contemplations on Amida Sutra, Bussetsu Kanmuryo Jukyo, and the smaller Skavati Vyuha Sutra, Bussetsu Amida Kyo, the smaller sutra on Amida Buddha. We chant this Amida Kyo often during our Shotsuki monthly memorial service here. And that chant takes about 20 minutes when we chant that one. And of course, the larger sutra is quite a bit longer than that. And the contemplation sutra is also quite a bit longer. So we don't traditionally they chant those the whole thing. Many places will chant on a daily basis sections from these three Pure Lands as a part of their morning service. They would chant like maybe 3 pages of the whole sutra. And of course, we do chant parts of the larger sutra when we chant the Sambutsuge and the Juseige are both songs that come out from this larger sutra. But the three Pure Land Sutras lay the foundation for what we call the Pure Land Gate of the Buddha Dharma. And through the many centuries, there have been great monks in India, China, and Japan who studied and made commentaries to clarify the meaning of these three sutras. So Shinnan's teacher, Honen Shonin, said that there were actually 6 great monks he named through India, China, and Japan. And to this, Shinran also added his teacher, Honen Shonin. So in Jodo Shinshu, we call them the 7 patriarchs of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. And they are, by name, I've listed them here, Nagarjuna Bodhisattva, Vasubandhu Bodhisattva, or Ryuju Bosatsu and Tenjin Bosatsu. These are both individuals from India. And then the next 3 are China, Tanwan, or Donnan Daishi in Japanese, Taocho, or Doshaku Zenji in Chinese or Japanese, and Shantao, or Zendo Daishi in Japanese. These 3 are from China. And then finally, the last 2, Genshin Kasho, Japan, and Genku Shoni. This Genku is the posthumous title for Honen Shonin, Shinnan's teacher. So Shinran calls these the 7 patriarchs. And they're called patriarchs because they have 4 things. Oh, why do I only have 3 here? First, they had a desire. They all make an observation that they want to be born in the Pure Land, and they all write some commentary pertaining to the sutras, and they all introduce a new concept in furthering the understanding of Pure Land sutras. So there's only 3. I don't know why I have 4. Anyways, these are reasons why these individuals are considered Pure Land masters. However, what I wanted to point out here was that for the largest portion of the time, although we call it Pure Land Gate or Pure Land School Buddhism, majority of these 7 patriarchs were monks from different schools of Buddhism who have written about Pure Land Buddhism. So let's see. I haven't handed this part out yet, but oops, sorry. Let me just pull up. Oh no, it's not right away. Oh, well, I will pull up. And I've showed this before, and I think I could send it out again, but where's that? Huh? What happened to it? Sorry, I was just oh here. Huh? Oh yeah. And I need to share this. Sorry, I just okay. You all have this, I believe, or many of you have this diagram that I sent before. I could send it out again, but this basically shows the what we call the seven patriarchs. And this first person, his name was Nagarjuna, and he lived in India 150 to 250 AD. So remember how I mentioned how Ashoka, the king, he was about 258 BC. So it's like 300 years after Ashoka that this Nagarjuna appears in this world. And in fact, Nagarjuna, he was actually born in the southern part of India, and he belonged to Brahmin family. And so he learns about Hinduism first, and he studies what we call the Vedas, or the Vedic writings, before he enters Buddhism. And he begins by studying the Buddhism that spread to southern, so the Theravada teachings. And then later he would go north to the Himalayas, where he would begin to examine the Mahayana teachings. And he is known for, in the Mahayana school, he is often known as the father of Mahayana Buddhism, because many of the different Mahayana schools will include Nagarjuna as part of their patriarchs. So even though we say he's one of the seven patriarchs of Pure Land Buddhism, he's also one of the patriarchs of Zen Buddhism. He's also one of the patriarchs of Tibetan Buddhism. Various Buddhist schools recognize him as being one of their patriarchs. So even though we say he's a Pure Land master, there's an aspect of him that talks about Pure Land teachings. He has some writings about Pure Land teachings, but he also wrote about many other things. And the one most famous for is what we call Madhyamika, the middle path. So what Nagarjuna realized, and what he stated, was that he denounced both affirmative and negative. Let's see. Let me just bring this up here. Excuse me for a second. I'm going to be bringing up something different. Okay. Yeah. So with Nagarjuna, right? So the historical Buddha actually prophesied, or he predicted, that this individual Nagarjuna would appear in southern India destroying what we call the false views of existence and non-existence. In a sutra called Lankavatara Sutra, this is when the historical Buddha visited what we call Mount Lanka. He predicted this, that this individual would arise. And Shinan Shonin, in his Shoshinge that we studied last fall, he mentioned this in one of the passages. He says, Shakyamuni Tathagata on Mount Lanka prophesies to the multitudes that in southern India, the Mahasattva Nagarjuna would appear in this world to crush the views of being and non-being. So what this crushing the view of being and non-being means is that the Madhyamika school of Buddhism, it rejects all negative and positive propositions regarding phenomenal events. So basically what he said was that all things, all phenomenal events come about due to causes and conditions. Thus, there's nothing that exists intrinsically by itself. Okay, so everything is because of many causes and conditions that it exists. So when those causes and conditions change, so also the existence changes. So what he did was say that there was neither the complete existence of things, but he also rejected that there is. He also rejected the nihilistic view, and but what he said is that there is a middle path in between the two, that is the real existence of things. And when we begin to see things in this interconnected way, then you can get to a point of what we call sunyata. And this sunyata is seen in Mahayana Buddhism. It's one of the fundamental principles of Mahayana Buddhism. And that's stating basically, one translation of sunyata is emptiness. But emptiness here does not mean zero, like nothing. Emptiness means there's no intrinsic self, but when we get to that understanding or realization, awakening, then we realize that it's actually emptiness equals the infinite. So we become one with the infinite. And so there's a transcendence that takes place. So with the Pure Land school of Buddhism, how this Nagarjuna or Ryuju Bosatsu comes, why he is important, is because in one of his writings, in the commentary on the chapter of 10 stages of the Garland Sutra, he writes, there are two innumerable modes of entry to the Buddha's teachings, just as there are in the world difficult and easy paths. Traveling on foot by land is full of hardship, and traveling in a boat on a sea route is pleasant. So it is among the paths of the Bodhisattva. Some diligently exert themselves in practice, while others quickly enter non-retrogression by an easy path based on the entrusting mind. Okay, so what he suggested in his writings was that in this level of transcendence, so as we get to this ideology of sunyata or emptiness, we realize that emptiness is equal to transcendence. And this level of transcendence is also known as the first bodhisattva stage. Okay. In the Buddhist way of thinking, it was said that there are 52 stages to enlightenment. And the first 40 of those stages, you can advance ahead, but if you're not diligent, you'll go backwards. But when you get to the bodhisattva stage or the transcendent stage, at that moment, it may not be at that instant, but you're guaranteed a nirvana. You're not going to go sliding backwards from there. So that's the 41st stage on the 52 stages of enlightenment. Okay. So to get to that 41st stage, Nagarjuna says there are different ways of practice. One is what we call the difficult practice, and that he compares it to like traveling on land. Okay, it's a lot of effort has to be done. But he said there is another path, and he calls this the easy path. And that path is by letting the, in this case, Amida Buddha do all the hard work. So by getting on the boat, he said, and you let the captain of the boat take you, it's much easier for you. You don't have to do all the hard work. Somebody else is doing the hard work for you. So he makes that comparison, hard practice versus easy practice. So because he talked about this, and he basically said that easy practice is getting on the boat that is commandeered by Amida. That is what he called the easy practice. However, what we have to also keep in mind is that, and as far as Nagarjuna is concerned, he is still talking about practice. Okay, how to get to this stage. And so this practice he's talking about, he is still very much focused in for monastics. So what he's talking about, practice for the monks, that there's an easy practice versus a difficult practice. Okay. We don't get into practice for lay individuals up until the time we get into Japan. So this is something very important to keep in mind, that difference between, particularly between Honen and Shinran and all the previous great masters, is that all the previous great masters looked at these practices as part of a monastic training. Okay, it wasn't necessarily meant for the lay person. So Nagarjuna, although we consider him one of the seven patriarchs, he's still talking very much for monastics, not the average person. Although today we reinterpret it, or through Shinran Shonin, we reinterpret it. And Shinran basically said that this easy practice is for anyone, whether you're a monk or a lay person. It didn't really matter. But around the time of Nagarjuna, it was still very much different. Practice was for monastics. And so even though he said there's difficult and easy practice, they were both meant, he was addressing the monastics and not the lay people. Okay. So, and he gave three reasons for not doing the regular bodhisattva practices, but instead relying on the Buddha, Amida Buddha, for easy practice. And he said, first of all, that there are too many practices to follow if you were to do the regular path. And he says it takes an extremely long time, and the dangers of falling into pitfalls of falling into either nihilism or what we call the Sarvaka or Pratyeka Buddha. So these are levels that are just below enlightenment, but he's saying by doing the hard practices, one can get into a false sense of security that you are moving along the way when in actuality you're stuck at this lower level. So he said by relying on the Buddha, relying on the Buddha, um, we could transcend all of that. So this was Nagarjuna. Okay. So he's already defined the differences between this difficult versus easy. And the next individual in the Indian or the seven patriarchs, the second of the Indian one, is what we call Tenjin Bosatsu or Vasubandhu. Okay. And Vasubandhu is known for his Abhidharma doctrine and also his Yogacara school of Buddhism. So Yogacara Buddhism is really about the consciousness Buddhism, and this I mentioned before, but this Yogacara talks about how we have different levels of consciousness. We have our five sensory our organs, and associated with that we have our five um, perceptions that we perceive from that, and we also have our conscious mind, and then below that we have our subconscious, and below that subconscious we have what we call the alaya alaya consciousness, and often it's talk about like a storehouse where all our experiences go into this storehouse. So again, although we call Vasubandhu within our Pure Land lineage, we call him one of the seven great patriarchs, he was actually probably more well known as this Yogacara Buddhist monk. But because he also wrote commentaries on Pure Land Buddhism or on the Pure Land Sutras within the Pure Land lineage, he's considered as one of the seven patriarchs. But he's also considered as one of the great patriarchs of the Yogacara school of Buddhism as well. But with Vasubandhu, he wrote a treatise on the Pure Land, and he basically broke it down into two parts. One was a verse, and the second was prose. And in there, he states that, "O world on everyone, with singleness of mind, I take refuge in the Tathagata of unhindered light, shining throughout the 10 directions, and aspire to be born in a land of peace and bliss." So he basically says that he wants to be born in Amida's Pure Land. And he clearly defines the Pure Land practice as a distinct way in which one could attain nirvana in the Mahayana school of Buddhism. So again, even though he's showing a way, it's still very much for the monastic practice. But this is a viable practice within by the Sangha, the monks and nuns. So Vasubandhu, or Tenjin Bosatsu in Japanese, is considered one of the seven patriarchs. So I'm going to just stop here tonight. I will continue on with this next time, and I want to try to get through these patriarchs so that I could get to Shinran and, more importantly, Tanisho. But in order to understand the Tanisho, we really need to have this understanding of these, how the lineage was developed. So that's why we're doing this right now. Are there any questions? And I'll send out this section. I think parts of it you already have, but I will send out the section on the bodhisattvas. Okay, and I'm going to stop sharing. And maybe. So does anybody have any questions or comments? Michael, Rose, Marilyn. Let's see, anybody? If you have any questions, or if not, you could email me as well. Are you able to follow what I've been saying, or have I just been rambling on? You have to unmute yourself if you wanted to say anything.
I think I've been following along, Sensei.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, if nobody has any questions, then I will see you next week, and we'll continue on from here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sensei.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Sensei.
very much.
Thank you,
Thank you
Sensei.
very much,
Bye.
Thank
Sen.
you, Sensei.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.